Let's revisit sex again. Sex as a purificatory practice, a particularly speeding up process of the purification of the lower three centers. When we're talking about sexuality, we're referring energetically to the sacral center. And this is the place where there's a transformation very deeply into the Uranian quality of life eventually. But part of that is working with this scorpionic process, the astral process of purification that Scorpio speaks of. There is something about our physical, creative manifestation of reality that's really tied up with the sexual center. And Mars often is, even though it's connected specifically to the solar plexus, it does speak to body identification as a whole. And in exoteric astrology, it's often considered whenever you're looking at sexuality or the drives of desires and attraction and all of this. And a hint there at the Aries Libra axis and its lower expression there of love, lust, sex, and coming to its opposite there in terms of a psychological level. So, point being, this focus on the sacral center. When we're talking about the change of the approach to sex when we're considering the soul, a lot of it has to do with the reorienting of that which moves purely from the physical level of identification, which is just lower desire, into the pinning down of all the elemental forces of the physical body by the love principle. And this is where sex, when you're working with someone, when you have a soul-based intimate relationship and you're working with the other to help support the solar process, you start working with these more lunar mysteries, the mysteries of the form, the wisdom there, in seeing the connection there. And what happens is the soul necessarily has to overtake and move the body into love. And this also is true for the physical level. Most people, when it comes to sex, they're driven from that lower lust and desire. And this is where we see when people get into relationships, there's often waxing and waning phases of sexuality, for instance, where it's quite strong at the beginning and it fades out. But that's really because the libido itself, the sexual energy, is always wanting to drive towards some degree of satiation and an experience of wholeness. And speaking to that, what we spoke of with the Neptune video of Mars, personal desires elevating to the one true universal desire, which is for God or for Christ or for universal love, and merging with the God principle through the Satratma and all of this. So sex really is a reflection of that at the physical level. But when it's moving purely from personal identification, it's just moving with those whims of the personal form, for instance. So where we see mature Tantra teachings for people that have really worked with this, there's often this emphasis on making sex a disciplinary practice. And we don't really like that idea from the level of the personality, because we think it's about what I want and what feels good for me and following what feels good to me. But just like anything else, sex becomes a practice of love, a living practice of love, and it's about showing up to that practice even when you don't feel like it. And this is assuming, of course, that you're with someone where all the other things are, all the other ducks in a row, so to speak. We've got a trusted connection there, there's shared values and all of these things, because using sex as a disciplinary practice of love, when you haven't got those other things, is kind of useless, and it can feel kind of controlling or it just gets out of whack at that stage. So what we see here when we're working with the soul and when we've got two people that are serving that soul principle is that sex, the process of sex, becomes this active meeting of the two, where the intimacy often stimulates something that's unregenerated within the lower three centers. And this is why we can often feel resistance at this stage to actually coming into physical union. But this is only because the body, when we're speaking about this esoterically, the body is representative of the past. And when we're working with the soul, we're penetrating the future into the past. And so there's often a degree of resistance. But to regenerate, Scorpio, regenerate some of the dense energies that, as a consequence of not being regenerated, tend to slow aspirants and especially disciples down. Because when we're talking about discipleship, the soul's really gotten hold of the body at that point. Okay, so it's a slightly different dynamic. But that to get to the Uranian quality, remember Uranus is exalted in Scorpio, there needs to be that consistent penetrating of the depths of the Maya and turning that dense energy over. And sex is one of the best ways to do that, but it's not pursuing sex from the personal me as the lower elemental that wants its self-satiation from its point of identification and thus separation, because that sense of self is not moving with the Christ principle, it's not moving with the soul principle. So it's kind of like, it's just what I want, but that self has to die. That's the Mars thing there, right? Moving towards the sacrifice of itself. So sex, then, you come together, you move with the intention of moving with sex consciously, and it's about the deepening of the love principle into the lower centers. And what we find there is that all kinds of things can open up. There's certain resistances that can come up, or particularly in the woman's body, there's all sorts of, particularly with the female sex organs, they're so deeply receptive, so all sorts of pockets can come up there. There's ancestral stuff that's often stored within the gonads. Think of the sperm and the egg, right? This is our very points of origin within the body. So there's all kinds of things that can open up there. And it's whether, penetration happens or not, it's just the intention to come together with that intimate connection. And once again, all these mature Tantra teachings, I would say, they always speak to, you want to practice sex when you least want to do it, because when you're moving with consciousness, it's that principle of love is always going to reveal these dense places of the lowest centers of the lower chakras where there's a very deep holding, and often that's why resistance can come up there. So we're penetrating the past, and just as we do that through meditation, for instance, or through connecting to the different energy centers in the body, sex can actually become a vehicle for that process where you come together in that intimate connection with the intention of love. It's not about I'm getting off on you and you're getting off on me, because that comes from body identification and it's fundamentally selfish. It's not to shame, by the way, in an old moral Christian way, that the reality of the animal body. That's not what I'm talking about here. But when we're talking about solarization and when we're moving with this point of astrally purificatory process, then that's really, it can really speed things up, basically. Working with a partner with this work absolutely speeds things up in so many different ways, because the Taurus, Scorpio, Aries, Libra axis really speaks to those qualities of desire and the astral nature and psychic wholeness, death and desire coming to its end, death, regeneration. Scorpio, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aries, Libra, the lower lust or the projection game, or that which comes up with the other in terms of the projection of the anima or the animus, or all sorts of things come up here. And there's many different ways that we could go into talking about the things that come up, but it's slightly different for every person. And it's really, the wisdom of it gets revealed anyway, just as a result of the practice, when you have two people that are moving intimately with this process, with the intention of moving with the soul, with the intention of healing, loving and purifying the body. And we see that when we're doing this with the soul, that the body often resists because it's holding on to a lot of stuff. It's the way in which the feminine is, it's holding on to all that density. And when you push love into it, it's necessarily those first layers that get penetrated of any particular level of the spiral are often because it opens up something painful. It opens up some level of personal identification, but that's exactly why it's a purificatory process, because that which gets brought up in that process is something that needs to be released, loved, met intimately, and then healed through that process. And when a person can meet us in that process as well, it does wonders for the healing of so many of our human issues, which do connect to intimacy, because we're often so at the playing out of our karmic dynamics and the pain and the way we've abandoned one another, that's relational, right? So meeting someone in that loving process, and especially with the situation right now with the denigration of the feminine Eros being pushed into the depths, there's often, particularly in the female sex organs, a lot that rises with the rejection, rage. It's very deep within the female sex organs there particularly. And that the rage at having the abandonment by consciousness as the masculine principle. But aside from it being about men, it's really about the consciousness of the human being, male or female, entering the depths. So it happens for both people, even though it's slightly more exaggerated, that problem within the female body, just naturally because of her orientation as woman being slightly more plugged into the earth, and the sex organs in the female body being very receptive. And that connects her to the menstrual cycle as well. And when women move consciously with the menstrual cycle, there's a lot to do with astral purification there. The capacity for internal purification is really quite something with the female body when it's moving with the love principle at the center of that. Okay, so I'm just touching on that generally today, but the core with this is, one, you assume you're already with someone where the drive towards the soul, and it's like the true marriage here, where this person isn't going to call it quits no matter what. You're both in it. That's the real marriage. It's the true function of marriage, by the way. It's like the alchemy of the psychology that happens within the marriage dynamic between two people when you make it so that you can't leave no matter what. That's the incarnation of the love principle. There's nowhere for the lower self to escape off to. That's what the real bondage is, but it's not a bondage to form, actually. It's a bonding the forms together so that the consciousness can actually die and be regenerated. This is the true marriage. Of course, many people get married, they get the certificate of marriage, but they haven't actually made that interior movement. They're not actually, they haven't made the commitment. So it's really about the interior movement of, no matter what, I'm not abandoning the love principle here. And so the two people, it becomes less about what the two bodies are as the personalities, but what the soul principle is in action, what the God principle is in action when you bring the form together, the integrity of the male-female principle and the form level, and you use that as a vehicle for the incarnation of the love principle. This is why we can consider sex, let's say Uranian or seventh ray, with its connection to the sacral center and Scorpio, but really it turns over into a very Virgo type process. It's the lunar process of the healing and the purification of the form, and working with the energies of substance itself to use Eros to help return back to itself and deepen the human being into the earth. Because this is really what the grounding of Eros does, by the way. Eros isn't about the pursuit of the desire that I want satiated. This is how Eros expresses from its unregenerated body identification, unconscious state. Eros, as the real sacral center, this is a hint at the Uranian quality as well. Eros is that which creates you as an individual. And that's why it has to be subservient to the love principle, because that creational force is so immensely powerful that when it's rising from body identification and hasn't been regenerated by love, it'll just do whatever it can to escape from meeting whatever layers of pain are in the unconscious. It's just too powerful, that it's powering so much of the psychology of the individual. This is why that alchemy of that completely committed dynamic is non-negotiable. And until people make that commitment, they actually don't access this point of wisdom, because it's not until you really put yourself in a situation where I can't leave no matter what, that it pins down certain aspects of the elemental forces, and it crucifies parts of the self-identification. And then what happens on the other side is, oh, there we go, there's the healing, there's the new space, there's the level of regeneration, and then at the human level, beautifully, the intimacy within two people, but also the marriage between the lower self in regenerating that lower substance and the higher self, and the opening of the individual body to be a greater holder of the Christ principle, essentially, and as well as merging into the earth. And it helps, our modern problem of being disconnected to the earth is all connected to this, the busyness and all of the ways in which consciousness can scatter. So you focus consciousness and it brings it all the way down. This is the real tantric process. And in connection to the soul, it serves as a healing function of the body, the opening of and the transfiguration of the sex energy, so that you're opening the creative force and the power principle there in terms of just magnetic substance and being in the realm of substance and of the waters of substance. It's the astral plane or whatever. And speeding up the process of working out those psychological problems, animus, those desires which rise from a hidden part of the psyche, which are moving from that point of identification, from that ancestral pain, karmic problem, blah, 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 all of this. So sex becomes an agent for the complete and total commitment of the love principle, and you're utilizing the energies of substance as the material energies, as that of substance, of matter, of the mother, the lower three centers, all of the dense potency of that to help deepen, regenerate, heal, purify, and open the human being. So a true sex practice will make you more of an individual. It will bring wholeness, because the true purpose of the marriage function, of the alchemy of love, when it comes into that total commitment, is that the real love makes the other person whole. That's what Jung said. It's 1000% true. I can tell you in my experience with this process, as much as when you get to those edges where you really want to get away, it's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've bound myself to this person, this circumstance. But when you stick with that, something happens in the consciousness, something dies and is reborn, and it's just like, it is just no regrets. Once you experience this a few rounds, a few times, nothing beats it. It is this deep kind of human satisfaction, that, as well as this incredible intimacy and productivity, actually, just from the soul point of view, in terms of what it can do to open, heal, and vivify the human form, and bring you closer to that individuality and that core center of rock solidity in yourself, that also makes you reliable with the use of power, especially when we talk about the moving with the even ray line 1357, moving with the greater penetrative forces, occult, esoteric forces. Because wherever there's a lack of love, that's where the power, the will to power, will take hold of the body. And this is where we get all the kinds of glamours and corruptions that we can see. So, okay, sex is a purifying principle, the incarnation of the love principle in its strongest, most actualized human potentiality, something like that.